You know this kit. Even if you don't follow football, even if you don't know a single Juventus player, you know these stripes. Black and white. Vertical, clean, one of the most recognized sporting identities on the planet. Worn by some of the greatest footballers who ever lived. Associated with power, with glamour, with winning. Now, what if I told you that for the first 6 years of Juventus's existence, they wore pink? And what if I told you the reason they stopped, the reason those black and white stripes exist at all, is because a small club in the English Midlands happened to have some spare jerseys lying around? Turin, 1897, to understand this story. You need to understand what Juventus actually was when it started. It wasn't a club. Not really. Not in any sense we'd recognize today. It was a group of students. Boys, mostly, ranging from 15 to 17 years old, gathered in a school in Turin in November 1897. They wanted to play football. They gave themselves a name Juventus, Latin for youth, and they went looking for somewhere to play and something to wear. Turin in 1897 was a city in transformation. Italy had only been a unified nation for 30 years. The Industrial Revolution was arriving. The middle classes were sending their sons to school, and some of those sons were picking up this strange English game that was spreading across the continent like a quiet contagion. Football was new. It was exciting. It was modern. And these boys wanted to be part of it. Their first proper kit was pink. Specifically pink shirts with a black tie, which sounds baffling by modern standards but was fairly unremarkable at the time. Pink was a common color for sporting clubs in late Victorian and Edwardian Europe. It didn't carry any of the cultural associations it has now. It was simply a color. Practical, available, affordable, Juventus wore pink for the better part of 6 years. They won their first Italian championship in pink in 1905. They were becoming a real club, with real ambitions, with real players. And then something very mundane happened. Their supplier ran out of pink fabric. The supply problem here is the part of this story that nobody really dwells on, because it's so unglamorous. There's no drama here. There's no great decision, no visionary moment. There's just a practical problem with no fabric to solve it. The supplier Juventus relied on and the precise details of who this supplier was have been blurred by more than a century of retelling, simply couldn't source enough pink material to produce a fresh batch of playing shirts. That's it. That's the crisis. Not a war. Not a financial catastrophe. Not a boardroom argument about identity and colors. A textile shortage. But this was 1903. You couldn't just go online and find a different supplier in 30 seconds. International trade existed, but sourcing goods from abroad took time, took contacts, took relationships. You needed to know someone. And it turned out Juventus knew exactly the right someone, even if nobody involved could possibly have understood at the time what the consequences would be. The Englishman in Turin, his name was John Savage. He was an Englishman, a player, and a football enthusiast who had found his way to Turin at a time when English influence over continental football was enormous. England had essentially invented the organized version of the game. English coaches, English players, English administrators were spreading out across Europe, carrying the sport with them like missionaries carrying a gospel. Savage was one of these men. He was involved with Juventus, and when the club found themselves without a reliable kit supplier, he did what anyone would do. He thought about home. Specifically, he thought about Nottingham. Now, why Nottingham? This is where the story takes on an almost absurd quality. Savage had connections to a club in Nottingham, a club called Notts County. And Notts County, as it happened, had spare jerseys available. The colors of those jerseys were black and white stripes. So Savage arranged for a consignment of Notts County shirts to be shipped from Nottingham to Turin. And Juventus, who had no particular strong feelings about what color their shirts were, they just needed shirts put them on. And that was that. Notts County, here's the thing about Notts County that makes this story even stranger. Notts County is the oldest football league club in the world, founded in 1862. They predate Juventus by 35 years. They were playing organized football before most of Europe had heard of the sport. And their black and white stripes, the stripes that would accidentally become one of the most iconic visual identities in sport, were almost certainly inspired by the magpie, the black and white bird that gives the club its nickname. By the time those shirts made their way to Turin, Notts County were a mid-tier English club. They'd had some success in the early years of the Football Association Cup. They were not glamorous. They were not rich. They were, in the grand scheme of football history, a fairly ordinary club from the East Midlands. They had no idea they were about to accidentally dress one of the great footballing empires of the next century. There's something almost comic about the image. A small English club has surplus jerseys. An Englishman abroad needs to solve a kit problem. The jerseys get shipped across Europe. And the club on the receiving end, a student club in Turin that had been pink for 6 years and had no particular attachment to any color, simply adopted them and kept going. What the stripes became Juventus went on to become the most successful club in Italian football history. 36 Serie A titles, 15 Coppa Italia trophies, 2 European Cups. Players whose names became synonymous with the sport itself: Michel Platini, Roberto Baggio, Alessandro Del Piero, Zinedine Zidane, Gianluigi Buffon, Cristiano Ronaldo. And through all of it, through every era and generation and reinvention, the stripes stayed. Because here's what happens when an accident lasts long enough: it stops being an accident. It becomes identity. It becomes history. It becomes something people feel in their chest. Juventus fans don't look at those black and white stripes and think about a textile shortage in 1903. They think about Del Piero's free kicks. They think about Buffon's saves. They think about the nights when the Allianz Stadium was so loud, the ground seemed to shake. The stripes don't mean supply chain problem. They mean Juventus, but they also mean Notts County, whether anyone acknowledges it or not. And Notts County, the oldest football league club in the world. The club that accidentally dressed a dynasty have spent most of their history bouncing between the lower divisions of English football, largely unknown outside their own fan base, playing in front of crowds that would fit comfortably inside a corner of the stadium that now bears Juventus's sponsor's name. This is how identity actually works. Not through grand decisions made in boardrooms by people with vision, through accidents, through shortages, through an Englishman in Turin who knew someone in Nottingham who happened to have some spare shirts. Juventus's identity, the thing their fans tattooed on their arms, the thing that made their kit one of the most sold in the world, came from a problem nobody could solve. And somewhere in Nottingham, on a ground called Meadow Lane that holds about 20,000 people on a good day, there's a club wearing black and white stripes that gave something to the world without ever meaning to. They didn't build an empire. They just ran out of pink fabric. And everything that followed was an accident.